Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, December 5th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about former Senator David Perdue announcing his primary bid for Georgia's governor race in 2022 against the incumbent governor, Brian Kemp, the former Secretary of State, who was first elected back in 2018 against Stacey Abrams, a return candidate for the 2022 midterm elections. Now, many people expected with this announcement from Stacey Abrams that the race was going to get more competitive. People expected the race to ultimately funnel down into being a Brian Kemp-Stacey Abrams race once again. But the national environment is going to be very different for 2022. In 2018, Brian Kemp was the Trump-endorsed, Trump-backed candidate. Following the 2020 presidential election, in which Brian Kemp certified Joe Biden's victory across the state of Georgia, Donald Trump was relentless. He vilified Brian Kemp and made it so Brian Kemp is no longer even the frontrunner for the Georgia gubernatorial Republican primary and potentially the general election. Running against a former state representative, with David Perdue's announcement not fully in effect yet. The only person challenging Brian Kemp with an outspoken name for themselves is Vernon Jones, a former Democrat who changed in 2020 to endorse Donald Trump in the presidential election. A long-standing Democratic representative who ultimately says, now I'm going to be running for United States governor of the state of Georgia. And you can see here in the endorsements for Vernon Jones, you have Michael Flynn, Rudy Giuliani. You have notable names from the Trump wing of the Republican side that are propping up Vernon Jones. Brian Kemp only received the endorsement from the Attorney General of Georgia. And you can see here that while I did say Brian Kemp wasn't the front runner, I meant that now with David Perdue's announcement. You can see here that before David Perdue had even floated the possibility of running for governor, he was receiving 16% against Brian Kemp. Now, as the incumbent governor, you are supposed to be ahead by 20, 30 points, possibly more. In every single poll, Brian Kemp has failed to capture a majority of Republican voters. Can you imagine what happens in the general election? In one-on-one races, Brian Kemp doesn't seem to perform to the best. In August of 2021, there was a poll done by Fabrizio Lee and Associates that had Brian Kemp and David Perdue in a one-on-one race. Because some people could have envisioned this, and we'll talk about why they could have envisioned this, because this is not David Perdue's first 2022 bid, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Brian Kemp only defeated David Perdue by a margin of 6 percentage points, and this was before David Perdue even floated the idea of running for governor. Everybody knows Brian Kemp. A lot of people know David Perdue, probably about the same here. But looking at it, one of them was clearly and already running for governor at that point in time, and the other was just another notable name that people were considering. In fact, taking a look at the one-on-one race between Brian Kemp and Herschel Walker, if David Perdue is doing better than Herschel Walker in the polling data, well, that tells you a lot about what you need to know for this race, because honestly speaking, Herschel Walker at that point in time was heavily encouraged by the Trump wing, and a few months later was then endorsed by President Trump for the Senate election in the state of Georgia. So what you should take away from that is that David Perdue is absolutely a strong name for governor here and could realistically get rid of Brian Kemp entirely through a primary challenge. And the funny thing is, they have campaigned for each other and before, which is why this will be a very interesting campaign season for the Georgia Republican Party. And it also is something that I think damages the Republican Party's chances at winning the governorship in the state of Georgia. In 2018, the Republican primary here wasn't contested because Brian Kemp was endorsed by President Trump. The race actually started out lopsided. Internal polling data showed that the opponent here, I believe Casey Cagle, was in the lead. And then Brian Kemp, following that endorsement, was able to win the Republican primary. Well, he only ended up winning the general election by a margin of 1.4%. This is actually a race that in the 2016 presidential election went to the Republican Party, Donald Trump, by a margin of 5.1%. In fact, interestingly enough, 4 years ago, prior to the Georgia special election in the state, we actually had this exact Senate race. The one that now Raphael Warnock, a Democrat, holds, was previously won by a margin of 13.8% back in 2016. So Georgia has had some significant trends towards the left. In fact, when you take a look at the difference here, let's see if we can go ahead and find it on the presidential level at least, the change from 2012, the Atlanta metro area, which doesn't seem like a big portion of the state, but is 67% of the state's total population, you see shifts towards the left, even though the rest of the country went towards the right. Look at how overbearing that right is. Hillary Clinton lost the election, right? So she should have performed worse than Barack Obama. But specifically in the state of Georgia, more specifically in the Atlanta metro area, Douglas County, Fulton County, these DeKalb County, right? You have these major counties that were instrumental in Democratic victories that you saw the tides turn as recently as 2016 and then 2018 and then, of course, 2020. So what I mentioned before about David Perdue is that this is not his first bid for a 2022 race. In early 2021, he actually filed paperwork to run against Raphael Warnock. That's right, he put his name down as a potential candidate here. This was February of 2021. At this point in time, the national environment was much more pro-Biden than it is now. The national environment looked a lot better for the Democratic Party in the United States Senate. This is my December 2021 prediction, and Georgia is tilt Republican. Back in February, my prediction was that Georgia would be lean Democrat, and the Democratic Party I expected to actually gain a seat, with Pennsylvania flipping to the Democratic side. Today, I expect the Republican Party to pick up 4 seats. And maybe that's why David Perdue is now poised to run for a bid in the state of Georgia, not necessarily Senate, but more so across the state. And I think that he stays away from the Senate, not because he doesn't think he could win it. He would lose it in 2022. I certainly think he would have a pretty good shot. Rerun candidates don't always work, but again, Georgia is much more competitive than the standard state that has seen rerun candidates. For instance, Indiana, in which there was Evan Bayh, who vacated that seat back in 2010, ran for the same seat in 2016, lost by 10 points. But looking at Georgia specifically, Herschel Walker has already been endorsed. So that's why David Perdue is not going to run for Senate. In fact, a week after he said he was considering it, we knew that he wasn't going to be endorsed by Donald Trump in the Senate election specifically, but now he very well will be. And this doesn't seem to be a coincidence to me. If you know what I'm referring to, it's essentially the statement that Donald Trump released following Stacey Abrams' entrance into the race again, saying that, "I'll beat her again, but it will be hard to do with Brian Kemp because Make America Great Again base will just not vote for him because of what he did with respect to election integrity and 2 horribly run elections for president and then 2 Senate seats." He reiterates these lies that the election was stolen and blames it on Brian Kemp as the incumbent governor of the state. Ultimately, Republicans were very quick to turn on him, and he doesn't have much support across the state. And in that same statement, he says he's not going to endorse Brian Kemp, but some good Republican will run, and some good Republican will get my endorsement, and some good Republican will win. And that's what David Perdue is capitalizing off of. Perdue campaigned with Donald Trump back in December and January for the runoff election. He was here for a reason, with Kelly Loeffler, with Donald Trump, with these very notable names. And at that point in time, Donald Trump was against Brian Kemp. So David Perdue, in conjunction with Donald Trump, was against Brian Kemp as well. And in this campaign rhetoric, Donald Trump and David Perdue formed a very close relationship. And ultimately, David Perdue knows he has Donald Trump in his pocket. Right? There's a reason why Vernon Jones wasn't endorsed by President Trump. And President Trump actually has been very quick to endorse opposing GOP candidates here. For instance, in the state of Alaska, if we want to take a look at the 2022 United States elections, this is a Senate election, but still very relevant. In the Republican side, Kelly Tshibaka, who is nothing more than a former commissioner of the Alaska Department of Administration. And I don't say that to diminish her role, but I say in electoral politics in the United States Senate seat, typically speaking, you see top names such as Sarah Palin, the former governor of the state, who was the vice presidential nominee for a major party ticket in 2008. Or you have Mike Dunleavy, the former governor of Alaska. Or you have other top names. But Kelly Tshibaka, and in no type of way to diminish her achievements or goals, but she doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, right? And I say this to point out that Donald Trump was extremely quick to back candidates like her. He backed her immediately, even though Kelly Tshibaka wasn't necessarily the most delectable name. I think Sarah Palin certainly could have done much better against Lisa Murkowski in the state of Alaska, and I say that seriously speaking. But she was quickly endorsed because Donald Trump did not care who it was, as long as there was some major opposition to the candidates who he personally did not want to see win the race. Then that's what happened. It also happened in North Carolina. In the polling data here, you can actually see that in the preliminary numbers, Pat McCrory, the former governor of North Carolina, did well in the numbers. 48% in the primary, 40%. right here, between April and June, one candidate was endorsed. Well, it wasn't Pat McCrory, who was a huge proponent of President Trump. It wasn't Mark Walker, whose name is closely associated with President Trump. But instead, he chose Ted Budd, who he believed would be more pro-Trump and a better primary choice. Even though he wasn't in the lead in the polls, getting 9 and 5%, by no means the frontrunner. With that endorsement, it propelled him upwards. Immediately following that endorsement, he was at 19%, defeating Mark Walker. And then 21%, then 25%, now 33%. And the polls are 36, 33, 13. Before, it was 48 to 9 to 13. So you have seen significant changes. And I think that it is a very telling sign that Donald Trump did not endorse Vernon Jones immediately in this governor election, because I think in many ways he was anticipating the entrance into the race by someone like David Perdue. Now, David Perdue recently lost a Senate election in the state of Georgia, and I think we know this because it was heavily covered by the mainstream media and myself. And you can see that David Perdue lost the Senate election against Jon Ossoff. Now, this race is long gone for David Perdue. The next time it's up is in 2026, so he's effectively screwed over in the United States Senate race here. So Jon Ossoff, David Perdue faced off against each other. Ossoff actually performed worse than Raphael Warnock, and the reason for that was primarily because Kelly Loeffler was disliked more than David Perdue. Electoral history-wise, we can take a look at David Perdue's recent history. Have you ever heard of Dollar General? Well, David Perdue was the CEO of Dollar General and used that money and used that, networking to propel himself into a victory in the state of Georgia, ultimately winning in 2014 by a margin of 7.7%. But I want you to look at that margin of 7.7% and ask yourself, if 2 years later, under more pro-democratic circumstances, Johnny Isakson was to win by 13.8%, doesn't that say David Perdue might actually be a weaker type of candidate? And then, after the Democratic Party wins control of the House, and the only chance for the Republican Party to temper Democratic control is through these Georgia Senate runoff elections that occurred over 2 months after the regular election had concluded on the presidential race, the Democrats still end up winning. Jon Ossoff still ends up winning, and you can see it. And in the shift from November, compared to where the Senate race was before, David Perdue lost a lot of support. Because also, there's something that I think is very important to point out, specifically in Georgia, right? Looking at where the race stood before the runoff election, I want you to just completely understand where this puts us. In the older map, I don't know if it will show us, in the older Senate race, and maybe we can find it here because I think it is very interesting to take a look at. Let's go ahead and see if we can get to that. David Perdue actually had a lead over Jon Ossoff in the state of Georgia. He had a lead of about 2 points over Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff was barely cracking 47% across the state. And ultimately, he was able to strip votes away from David Perdue. Nearly 5 million people turned out in this race because they were super inspired. David Perdue has that baggage with him. Everything that was tackled onto him might help him through the primary because the things that were tackled onto him were election integrity lies. Well, to a significant portion of that Trump base, it isn't a lie. To them, they truly believe the election was stolen. And we know that the election was not stolen. That is not a partisan statement, and it is unfortunate that our American political reality has made it as such. But I'm not going to argue that point any further. I've been doing so for a year now. What we are looking at here is that what brought down David Perdue in the general election in these runoffs is what will propel him through the primary. And consequently, I think he might end up losing the general election against Stacey Abrams. We haven't seen much polling data between Stacey Abrams and potential contenders. What we know is that Brian Kemp will take at most a 4-point lead and then down to a 3-point lead over him. And that's considering the fact that Joe Biden is disapproved of by a margin of about 10 points across the nation. So knowing that, knowing how much the national environment is skewed against Joe Biden, about a negative 16 relative to where it was on Election Day in 2020, and the fact that Stacey Abrams is remaining within 3 points of the incumbent governor tells you a lot. But a contested primary never ends up helping the general election. If people can coalesce and they know who their candidate is now, they will end up having months in the advantage. The same way that Democrats absolutely have months in the advantage. In fact, not a single Democrat, not even a low middle name for the Democratic primary, has announced their bid for governor in the state of Georgia. They have cleared the field effectively for Stacey Abrams. and she will have months starting now to campaign against either David Perdue or Brian Kemp. But because there is now an extremely competitive primary, you are going to see Brian Kemp and David Perdue face off against each other, tear each other down at the benefit of the Democratic Party, all over the 2020 presidential election and the 2021 Senate elections, the same Senate election that David Perdue lost his Senate seat. So in many ways, Perdue could either be coming back for revenge or taking advantage of this possibility of him becoming the next governor. Because I do think that regardless of who enters into that race, I do think that if it isn't a Republican versus Stacey Abrams, the Republican, whoever it is, will still have a pretty good shot. The reason why is because Georgia is still a competitive state at heart. It doesn't really matter who the nominee is. Of course, there are disadvantages of having a very big primary, and I do think that you will see that in the general election. But ultimately, the race still will be competitive, and it would be naive to think otherwise. But taking a look right now, I think that this David Perdue, Brian Kemp matchup is going to be very fascinating, very interesting, and it will certainly be one of the closest races to watch. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.